In my last couple Genealogy of Wokeness videos, I discussed individual philosophers from centuries ago, whose thinking has permeated every pore of Western thought. Yet it does not always take centuries for certain ideas to sink in, especially when they are ideas backed by law. And one such recent source of fast, radical, law-enforced ideological change in the West, which led directly to the wokeness we're plagued with today, is the civil rights movement. Now, as people living long after the changes enforced by the civil rights movement and years of propaganda in school, it sounds blasphemous to doubt the justice of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. and Emmett Till are martyr saints of the new American order, for liberals and conservatives alike, and photographs of segregated drinking fountains and black men being sprayed with hoses remind us of the evils that white men are capable of apart from government intervention. But, aside from discussions of whether this is actually an accurate image of the white Americans of the past, we should at least be able to think critically about the changes that were made. Were they consistent with America's founding? Was the outcome positive? Did it accomplish the racial harmony that MLK dreamed of? Well, my answer to each of these questions is a strong no. And I would argue that the changes that were made were not simply minor changes to American law in order to make conditions better for black people. It was instead a radical change in American government, which could be rightly considered the founding of a new, distinct government from that founded in 1776. As Christopher Caldwell has argued in his excellent book, The Age of Entitlement, quote, "The changes of the 1960s, with civil rights legislation at their core, were not just a major new element in the Constitution, they were a rival Constitution." Many conservatives point to the civil rights movement as a period of positive change for racial reconciliation, which groups like Black Lives Matter simply take too far. But I would argue instead that the radical forms of forced association that we experience today are simply the logical outworking of the legislative shift of the civil rights era. The reality is that civil rights legislation created the legal circumstances that made the present woke regime possible. Forced association. The First Amendment of the Constitution includes the right to assemble, which has been interpreted as necessarily including the freedom of association. Segregation was believed by civil rights activists to be a violation of the freedom of association by limiting the ability of people to freely associate with one another. Yet their response was essentially to abolish the freedom of association altogether, not only assuring that people who want to associate can do so, but also forcing those who don't want to associate to do so as well. After the Brown decision concerning the integration of schools, Leo Strauss addressed the Hillel Foundation at University of Chicago, arguing that though he is sympathetic to the suffering of minorities, action in their favor should be tempered lest it lead to another sort of unfavorable outcome. He warned, quote, "The prohibition against every discrimination would mean the abolition of the private sphere, the denial of the difference between the state and society, in a word, the destruction of liberal society." Yet this warning was not heeded, and behold, out came modern society, in which bakers can be sued for not baking gay cakes. Employers have to worry about a lawsuit when firing a black person for poor job performance, and even naturally developing associations that simply happen to be a majority white are considered an expression of white supremacist injustice. The private sphere has indeed been abolished. Aside from personal friendships between individuals, every other form of association is now regulated according to an ideal of diversity, with the threat of legal action for those who fail to conform. And while it is taken for granted that the power of the pen, of rational dialogue leading to the eradication of all ignorance, is what led to this era of enlightened progress, the reality is that it has been entirely accomplished by coercion. In fact, the amount of resources and governmental power put behind these efforts is quite staggering, surpassing literally every other effort of any kind in American history. Caldwell writes, quote, "Costing trillions upon trillions of dollars and spanning half a century, it rivals, in terms of energy invested, the peopling of the West, the building of transcontinental railways and highways, the maintenance of a Pax Americana for half a century after World War II, or, for that matter, any of the wars the country has fought, foreign or civil. This unprecedented endeavor of government-enforced association, which has set the framework for progressive action in modern America, was accomplished because of the moral confidence which came from believing themselves to be on the right side of history, which enabled them to confidently manufacture consent through coercion without regard for the consequences." Caldwell continues, quote, "What made the modern framers of civil rights different from the 19th century ones was their conception of power and their genius for wielding it. They succeeded where their forebears had failed because they were confident in resorting to coercion, indifferent to imposing financial burdens on future generations, and willing to put existing constitutional freedoms at risk in order to secure new ones. The Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts provided permanent emergency powers to smash the sham democracy of the segregated South. They mixed surveillance by volunteers, litigation by lawyers, and enforcement by bureaucrats. This was a new model of federal government with a transformative power that was immediately apparent. Thoroughgoing and versatile, often able to bypass the separation of powers, civil rights law became the template for much of American policymaking after the 1960s, including on matters far removed from race. This was mostly on the grounds of its efficiency, but that efficiency rested on certain assertions about values. To set oneself against civil rights was to set oneself against the whole moral thrust of American government." End quote. These developments were not simply about positively advocating for the rights of black people, but also about tying up the loose ends of the Civil War. The South needed to be destroyed and all the vestiges of its culture dismantled. Power was thus stacked in the hands of managerial elites, in both the public and private sectors, with nearly absolute power to reward or punish behaviors they approve or disapprove of through legal or bureaucratic processes. Today, this power has been expanded far beyond the issue of race. Employers are no longer allowed to be discerning of the moral behavior of those they employ, instead being forced to practically hand over their company to someone who comes out as a sexual degenerate, should they demand it. And employees who hold personal opinions that aren't in line with the regime face the threat of losing their ability to make a living, should they express their opinions publicly. Employees will lose everything if they speak their minds, and employers are not free to associate with those they simply deem the best employees. Freedom of speech, while technically still on the books, has been effectively abolished under the guise of anti-discriminatory measures. This is not the Civil Rights Act taken too far. It is the Civil Rights Act taken to its logical conclusion. If discrimination is a crime, then there can be no freedom of association. We are left with no choice but to get in line with every regime opinion and affirm every immoral action they approve of, or else face the consequences. And this is not a bug, but a feature. If progressives are free to simply coerce people into associating with others and treating them as equal to themselves in every way, and have the institutional power and endless financial resources to do so, then the inevitable conclusion is globo homo. White American identity. Another way that the civil rights movement directly led to today's woke cancer is its redefinition of American history and white American identity. To cite Caldwell once again, he writes, quote, "Today, slavery is at the center of Americans' official history, with race the central concept in the country's official self-understanding. Never before the 1960s was this the case. For almost all of American history, racial conflict was understood as a set of episodes, some shameful, some glorious, set against a larger story about building a constitutional republic. After the 1960s, the constitutional republic was sometimes discussed as if it were a mere set of tools for resolving larger conflicts about race and human rights. What is significant about this is that every nation has a founding myth. Myths, by the way, are not necessarily untrue. They are simply traditional stories about the early history of a people, which provide definition to their identity. The nation of Israel's founding myth, which I believe to be a true, legitimately historical myth, was the deliverance of their forefathers from Egypt in the Exodus and the reception of the law of God at Mount Sinai. This founding myth communicated to them that they were a chosen people whose existence and independence was entirely a gift of God, which they could not have gained by their own strength. It defined their identity as a people chosen by God's grace from among all the nations. For the Romans, the story of Remus and Romulus, and later Virgil's Aeneid, are examples of founding myths. They invested the Roman identity with certain virtues by having them displayed in the heroes and circumstances that were involved in Rome's founding. The reason for this is that the early history of a people matters for their identity. People need to know where they have come from in order to know how to act properly according to their identity. What does it mean to be an Israelite? What does it mean to be a Roman? What does it mean to be an American? A nation's early history answers this question. Thus, to make such drastic changes as were made during the 1960s, it was necessary that the old American founding myth be replaced by a new one. Gone was the noble cause of the Puritans to be a city on a hill, creating a society around the law of God so that they might be an example of Christian virtue and justice for all nations. Gone was the genealogical and cultural heritage of English nobility that was still prevalent in the South. They were replaced instead with the discriminatory practice of slavery as the definitive principle of pre-Civil War America, and continued animosity toward blacks as the prominent characteristic of white men even after the war, especially in the South. What it meant to be American was now to be racist. The heroes of this new founding myth were martyr saints like MLK and Emmett Till, which of course required that their heinous sins be covered up in order to protect their saintly status. Folk musicians acted as shills for this new founding, with Bob Dylan performing a song memorializing the assassination of civil rights activist Medgar Evers at the Lincoln Memorial just before an MLK speech. Ironically, all the peace-loving musicians of the 60s who presented themselves as fighting against an oppressive regime were actually just propagandists, providing cultural goods to accompany a new regime that had far more control over everyone's lives than ever before. This movement successfully convinced white Americans that they were the worst, most hateful people who ever existed, whose history contained nothing but shame. Everything noble in their past was forgotten, and only greatly exaggerated accounts of their sins remained. The concept of systemic racism, which interprets literally anything white people have done or built as fundamentally racist, is thus simply the outworking of this redefinition of the white American identity. It is the continuation of what was essentially a rebranding of Reconstruction in the Civil Rights era, which aims to continue to divest America's founding demographic of its institutional power and redistribute it to people who will push a globo-homo agenda. It is the Northern Unitarian Universalists continuing to take vengeance on the South for not conforming to their attempts at centralizing power in their own hands. Racial justice, as it always has been, is just the justification, not the real motivation. It is simply about progressives giving more power to their friends and punishing their enemies. So the solution is not simply, as the normie conservatives think, to go back to civil rights-style anti-racism. That was just the wokeness of the 1960s, and it was only inevitable that it led to what we are experiencing now. The solution is instead to reject the premises of anti-racist movements altogether. No, whiteness is not a sin. No, America's history is not fundamentally evil. No, it is not unjust to prefer associating with people like myself. No, not all cultures are equal. We need to be proud of our heritage, love those who are like ourselves, and work to preserve our own culture. And before you accuse me of being a white nationalist or something, you should ask yourself why that exact statement would not be offensive to say if I were a Native American. The answer is simply that you have bought into the civil rights propaganda. Well, I don't, and no one should. Heritage, kinship, and shared religious values are the things that natural, traditional society is based upon. As should be entirely evident to anyone at this point in our present democratized, universalized, pluralistic society, is that rejecting these foundations results in a completely fragmented nation full of crime and people who hate each other's guts. Without natural affections and common religious values, there is nothing left to unify a people other than coercion. And that is exactly what the civil rights experiment is all about. It is the replacement of natural affection with coercion as the means of establishing societal unity. But coercion, as is greatly evident at this point in the West, is no real replacement. We will either love our own people, or we will be coerced to get along with a society of strangers by a bloated bureaucracy. These are our only two options. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and all that.